In the cold, entropic vacuum of the South Atlantic, where the logic of modern warfare meets the unforgiving laws of thermodynamics, there is a specific threshold where human skill ceases to be a variable. At 54 degrees south latitude, the ocean is not a battlefield. It is a heat sink. It does not recognize the sovereignty of nations or the elite status of the soldiers who navigate it. It only recognizes the transfer of energy. The Special Boat Service, SBS, is built on a philosophy of guile, while their counterparts in the Special Air Service, SAS, often operate with the aggressive, high-visibility kinetic energy of an airborne insertion. The SBS exists in the margins. They are the swimmers. Their medium is the water, a substance that is 800 times denser than air and 25 times more effective at stripping the heat from a human body. In 1982, as the British task force steamed toward the Falkland Islands, the SBS was tasked with the most isolated objective in the theater, the island of South Georgia. South Georgia is an 1,450 square mile shard of rock and ice, located 800 miles east of the Falklands. It is the peak of a submerged mountain range, a landscape of jagged ridges and glaciers that flow directly into the sea. To the Argentine military, South Georgia, or Isla San Pedro, was a symbolic victory. By occupying the whaling stations at Grytviken and Leith, they were establishing a historical and legal claim that predated the Industrial Revolution. Their logic was strategic. Hold the periphery to secure the center. To the British Admiralty, South Georgia was a logistical necessity. It was the gateway. If they could not retake South Georgia, the task force's flank would remain exposed to Argentine submarines and long-range reconnaissance aircraft. The operation was codenamed Paraquet. It was designed by a committee in London that viewed the Antarctic as a map, not an environment.
The primary tool of the SBS for this operation was the Klepper Arius II kayak. It is a masterpiece of minimalist engineering. A wooden frame covered in a skin of hypalon and canvas. It is silent, it has no radar signature, and it allows two men to penetrate a coastline undetected. But in the South Atlantic, the Klepper has a critical failure point. As the blades of the paddles lift out of the water, they carry a thin film of moisture. In sub-zero temperatures, that moisture does not evaporate, it crystallizes. The thin layer of ice on a kayak blade is a study in incremental weight. It begins as a microscopic frosting. Within an hour, it becomes a visible glaze. Within 3 hours, the paddle, a tool designed for fluid, rhythmic motion, becomes a heavy, unbalanced club. The ice changes the geometry of the stroke. It forces the muscles of the forearm to work harder to overcome the imbalance. It increases the metabolic cost of every movement. If you appreciate this objective dissection of military physics and the cold mechanics of survival in extreme environments, please consider subscribing to the channel. We analyze the intersection of human limits and environmental entropy, far from the sensationalism of typical military documentaries. The SBS operators who boarded HMS Antrim in April 1982 were the product of a selection process that prioritized thermal resilience and underwater intelligence. They were men who had spent thousands of hours in the freezing waters of the North Sea and the English Channel. They were thinking swimmers. They understood that in the water, panic is the primary cause of death, followed closely by the failure of the core temperature. The conflict of Operation Paraquet began not with a shot, but with a collision of doctrines. The task force included elements of the SAS, the SBS, and the Royal Marines. The SAS, true to their air lineage, wanted a rapid insertion via helicopter onto the Fortuna Glacier. They believed that the high ground offered the best observation points to monitor Argentine movements in Grytviken. The SBS, true to their boat lineage, argued for a coastal approach using their Klepper kayaks. The SBS view was grounded in a terrifying respect for the South Georgia weather.
They knew that at those latitudes, the wind, the willy wars, could accelerate from a calm breeze to 100 knots in less than 10 minutes. They knew that a glacier is not a road. It is a moving, fractured labyrinth of blue ice and hidden crevices. But the big war logic of the Admiralty favored speed. The SAS won the doctrinal argument. The plan was to land Mountain Troop D Squadron SAS on the Fortuna Glacier via Wessex helicopters from HMS Antrim. The SBS would be held in reserve, tasked with a secondary coastal reconnaissance. On April 21, 1982, the physics of the South Atlantic issued its first warning. As the Wessex helicopters, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Ian Stanley, struggled to maintain a hover over the glacier, the atmosphere was a chaotic swirl of diamond dust, microscopic ice crystals that can clog engine intakes and blind pilots. The SAS Mountain Troop was dropped into a world where the temperature was minus 20 degrees Celsius, with a wind chill that reached minus 40. Within 2 hours, the SAS realized their mistake. They were not occupying the high ground, they were being consumed by it. Their tents were shredded by the willy wars. Their heaters failed as the fuel thickened in the cold. Men began to enter the first stages of hypothermia, a state of cognitive decay, where the brain begins to prioritize the survival of the core over the execution of the mission. The thinking soldier was losing the ability to think.
In the comments, I want to hear your perspective. When a mission's plan conflicts with the clear warnings of the environment, does the fault lie with the commanders who issued the orders, or is it a necessary risk in the uncertainty of war? The SAS called for an emergency extraction. The physics had won the first round. HMS Antrim sent 3 helicopters back into the whiteout. What followed was one of the most harrowing rescue operations in the history of the Fleet Air Arm. 2 of the 3 helicopters crashed into the glacier, their rotors shattered by the ice and the turbulent air. The SAS troopers and the air crews were now stranded in a biological vacuum, waiting for the one remaining helicopter to perform a mathematical miracle. Lieutenant Commander Stanley managed to load 17 men into a Wessex designed for 7. The helicopter groaned, its engines operating at the absolute limit of their structural integrity, and lifted off the glacier with inches to spare. The SAS insertion had failed. The air doctrine had been defeated by the atmosphere itself. The mission now fell to the SBS. The SBS mission was Operation Paraquet Phase 2, a coastal reconnaissance of the Leith whaling station. They would not use helicopters. They would use the Klepper kayaks. They would enter the water 5 miles out and paddle through the night, using the shadows of the cliffs to avoid Argentine radar. As the first 2-man team, Corporal Yorkie and his partner, lowered their Klepper into the black, heaving swells of Stromness Bay, the ice was already waiting. The water temperature was 0 degrees Celsius. The air temperature was -5. As they began the first stroke, the moisture on the paddle blades began its silent, incremental growth. The thin layer of ice had started to accumulate. The SBS operators were not under any illusions. They knew that if they capsized, their dry suits would buy them perhaps 6 minutes of functional life. They knew that the Argentine garrison at Leith was armed with heavy machine guns and night vision equipment. But their primary focus was not the enemy. It was the pace. In the SBS, the pace is everything. If you paddle too fast, you sweat. Sweat is moisture inside the dry suit. In the South Atlantic, moisture inside the suit is a thermal bridge, a highway for heat to leave the body. If you paddle too slow, you freeze from the outside in. You must maintain a metabolic equilibrium, a narrow corridor of exertion that keeps the core at 37 degrees Celsius without triggering the cooling mechanism of perspiration. They moved at 3 knots. Every 15 minutes they had to stop and scrape the ice from the paddle blades with their gloved hands. The ice was stubborn. It bonded to the carbon fiber in the wood, requiring a deliberate, forceful action to clear. Each time they stopped, the wind chill hit them like a physical blow.
Chapter 1. The Geometry of Entropy. The South Atlantic is a system that seeks to equalize all temperatures to zero. To the SBS, survival was the act of resisting that equalization. As they cleared the first headland, they saw the lights of Leith. The whaling station looked like a ghost town, a collection of rusted corrugated iron buildings and massive oil tanks silhouetted against the white peaks of the mountains. To the Argentines inside, Leith was a warm sanctuary. They had heaters, they had rations, and they had the confidence of a garrison that believed the coastline was impassable in April. The SBS patrol was now 2 miles out. The ice on the paddles was getting thicker. Yorkie felt the imbalance in his right arm. A mechanical fatigue was setting in. He was a professional, trained to endure weeks of subsurface operations, but the South Atlantic was not a training ground. It was an environment where the accumulation of small errors leads to a catastrophic collapse. The first error occurred at 200 hours.
A willy-war, a sudden, violent katabatic wind, roared down from the Fortuna Glacier. It hit the Klepper with the force of a truck. The kayak, which had been cutting through the water with the silence of a shark, was suddenly a leaf in a gale. The waves, previously 2 feet high, became 6-foot walls of white water. Yorkie dug his paddle into a wave, attempting to stabilize the craft, but the ice on the blade changed the drag coefficient. The paddle did not bite the water. It skated across the surface. The Klepper began to roll. In that microsecond, the 17-second rule of special operations was triggered. Yorkie and his partner had 17 seconds to prevent the capsize, or they would become a statistic of the South Atlantic. The thinking swimmer had to act before the cold-blooded animal took over. The paddle, heavy with ice, felt like a lead weight in his hands. He shifted his grip, searching for the structural center of the tool. He threw his weight to the opposite side, using the buoyancy of the kayak's side sponsons to counter the roll. The Klepper stayed upright. But as the wind continued to howl, Yorkie realized that the geometry of the mission had changed. They were no longer a reconnaissance patrol. They were a survival cell. The ice on the paddle was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical countdown. As we move into Part 2, we will look at the fracture of the plan, how the SBS attempted to land on the rocky shore of Grass Island, and how the thin layer of ice would lead to a decision that would redefine the limits of human guile. The South Atlantic was not done with them. The true Antarctic night was just beginning. The ice was growing, and the thinking swimmer was running out of heat. The metabolic cost of survival in the South Atlantic is a non-negotiable debt. Every movement made by a human being in sub-zero conditions is a withdrawal from a finite internal reserve of chemical energy. For the 2-man SBS team in the Klepper Aries II, the thermal debt was accumulating at a rate that the British Admiralty's planning staff in London had never modelled. To the planners, a 5-mile paddle was a distance. To the men in the water, it was a biological countdown. The thin layer of ice on the paddle blades was no longer a minor annoyance. It had become a structural parasite. By 0300 hours, the glaze had thickened to nearly half an inch. The paddles, originally balanced instruments of carbon fiber and wood, now felt like leaden clubs. Yorkie could feel the mechanical stress in his rotator cuffs and the tendons of his forearms. Every time he lifted the blade, he was fighting the gravity of the ice. The geometry of the stroke had collapsed. He was no longer slicing through the water. He was heaving against it. In the SBS, the operator is trained to be a thinking swimmer, but the cold has a way of degrading the thinking part of that equation. Hypothermia does not arrive as a sudden shock. It arrives as a slow, seductive fog. It begins with peripheral vasoconstriction. the body's tactical decision to abandon the fingers and toes to save the heart and brain. Then comes the shivering reflex, a desperate attempt to generate heat through involuntary muscle friction. But when shivering stops, the cognitive decay begins. Yorkie recognized the signs in himself. He found it difficult to calculate the distance to target. He found himself staring at the phosphorescence in the wake of the paddle, mesmerized by the glowing green swirls, forgetting for 3 or 4 seconds to execute the next stroke. He was losing his sensory vigilance. If you value this clinical examination of human endurance and the cold mathematics of elite operations, please consider liking the video. It helps our objective analysis reach those who prefer the weight of facts over the noise of sensationalism. The destination was Grass Island, a small, uninhabited outcrop in the center of Stromness Bay. It was the perfect observation post, OP. From its heights, the SBS could look directly down into the Leith whaling station, mapping the Argentine positions, counting their heavy weapons, and identifying the pattern of life of the garrison. But Grass Island was protected by a natural perimeter, a dense forest of giant kelp, Macrocystis pyrifera. Giant kelp is the barbed wire of the Southern Ocean. Its fronds can grow up to 150 feet long, creating a thick, tangled mat on the surface that can foul a propeller or trap a kayak. In the darkness, the kelp was invisible until the klepper's bow plowed into it. The kayak slowed, the rubberized skin groaning against the rubbery stalks of the seaweed. Yorkie and his partner had to hand paddle, reaching into the 0-degree water to pull the kelp aside. The water bypassed the seals of their gloves. The thermal bridge was now complete. The heat was leaving their hands at 25 times the rate it left through the air. In the cold, pain is a useful signal. It means the nerves are still firing. When the pain stops and is replaced by a dull, wooden numbness, the system is failing. They reached the rocky shoreline of Grass Island at 4:15. The landing was a study in frictional chaos. The rocks were covered in black ice, a transparent, frictionless coating of frozen sea spray. The swell was surging at 4 feet, lifting the klepper and attempting to smash it against the jagged granite. They had to wait for the third wave, the largest in a set, to lift them onto a ledge. They leaped from the kayak, their legs nearly useless from 5 hours of cramped stasis, and dragged the 18-foot craft clear of the surf. They moved with the jerky, uncoordinated motions of marionettes. Their fine motor skills were gone. They couldn't unzip their pouches. They couldn't operate the safety catches on their suppressed MP5s. This is the biological flaw of special operations. All the training, all the selection, and all the elite status of the SBS cannot bypass the fact that at 5 degrees below zero, the human hand becomes a blunt instrument. Chapter 2. The Logic of the Garrison. While the SBS team was struggling to maintain their core temperature on the rocks of Grass Island, the Argentine garrison at Leith was operating on a different internal logic. The Argentine soldiers were not the incompetent conscripts often depicted in British popular media. They were the buzos tácticos, tactical divers, and members of the Infanteria de Marina. They were professionals who had spent years training in the cold waters of Tierra del Fuego. Their logic was sound. No one would attack South Georgia in a gale. They had established sensors and patrols around the whaling station, but their vigilance sphere was limited to the land and the immediate harbor. They viewed the ocean as a neutralized zone because of the weather. They didn't have the institutional insanity of the British SBS, the willingness to put 2 men in a canvas boat in the middle of an Antarctic storm. This was the doctrinal gap. The Argentines were prepared for a big war encounter, a frigate or a helicopter assault. They were not prepared for the micro-war, the 2 men in the dirt. Yorkie and his partner hauled the klepper into a hide among the tussock grass. They didn't change into dry clothes. They didn't have any. They wrapped themselves in a single thermal bivouac bag and waited for the sun to rise. They ate high-calorie squeezy tubes of condensed milk and chocolate, fat and sugar to feed the metabolic fire. As the grey light of the Antarctic dawn broke over Stromness Bay, the thin layer of ice was no longer on their paddles. It was on their suits. It was on the grass around them. It was the skin of the world. From their vantage point on Grass Island, they deployed their primary weapon, the visual sensor. They used a 20 by 60 spotting scope to map Leith. They saw the Argentines clearing snow from their mortar pits. They saw the sentry rotations. They identified the headquarters building. They were digitizing the enemy, turning human movements into actionable intelligence for the coming assault. But the second SBS team, the one that was supposed to land on the opposite side of the bay, was missing. Their Klepper had been caught in a different current. The geometry of the bay had funneled them into a zone of extreme turbulence near the mouth of the harbour. Their paddle blades had iced over so quickly that they couldn't clear them. The imbalance had caused a capsize in open water. In the South Atlantic, a capsize is usually a death sentence. But these were SBS operators. They performed a dry roll, a maneuver where they used the momentum of the wave to flip the kayak back over before the cockpit could fully flood. They stayed in the boat, but they were now saturated. The dry suits had held, but the firmer layer underneath was damp with perspiration and the small amount of water that had bypassed the neck seals. They were forced to abort. They spent the next 6 hours paddling back toward the open sea, hoping to be picked up by HMS Antrim. They were no longer phantoms. They were targets for the cold. Back on Grass Island, Yorkie watched the harbour entrance. He saw something that changed the entire strategic calculus of Operation Paraquet. A dark shape was moving through the water, barely visible against the slate-grey waves. It wasn't a whale. It was a mechanical predator. It was the Santa Fe, an Argentine S-class submarine. It was sliding into Grytviken, carrying more troops, more supplies, and the capability to sink the British frigates that were the lifeblood of the task force. The thin layer of ice on the paddle had been the warning. Now, the steel hull of the submarine was the crisis. Yorkie reached for the radio. He had to transmit. But a radio transmission in the middle of an enemy-held bay is a bait. The Argentine signals intelligence teams in Grytviken were listening. If he keyed the mic, he was giving them a line of bearing to his position on Grass Island. He would be trading his invisibility for the warning. In the comments, tell us, in this situation, would you prioritize the intelligence gathering of the shore positions, or would you risk your life to report the submarine? Where does the thinking soldier draw the line between caution and sacrifice? Yorkie looked at the spotting scope, then at the radio. He realized that the small war was over. The big war had just arrived in the form of 2,000 tons of Argentine steel. The next 17 seconds would be the difference between a successful reconnaissance and a naval catastrophe. He keyed the mic. The thin layer of ice had been the beginning. The Antarctic night was now a theatre of fire. As we move into part 3, we will examine the collapse of the submarine, how the British fleet responded to the Santa Fe, and how the SBS team on Grass Island found themselves caught in the middle of a naval duel that no one had planned for. The ice was still growing, and the thinking swimmer was about to become an observer of the end. The depth was rising, and the world was turning white. The radio signal that Yorkie transmitted from the frozen spine of Grass Island was a microscopic ripple in the electromagnetic spectrum, but its effect was a gravitational collapse of the strategic situation. When the encrypted burst reached the communications center of HMS Antrim,
The small war of the SBS, the war of kayaks, kelp, and metabolic conservation, ceased to be an independent endeavour. It was instantly subsumed by the big war of the Royal Navy.
The data packet, less than 2 seconds of digital noise, contained the geometric coordinates and the identity of the Santa Fe. In the cold, clinical logic of naval warfare, a submarine in a confined bay is a shark in a bathtub. It is a catastrophic threat to surface vessels, but it is also a trapped predator. The Santa Fe, a Guppy II-class submarine of United States origin, was a relic of the late 1940s, much like the 25-pounder at Murbat. Its hull was a patchwork of Cold War steel and pressurized hydraulic systems that were nearly 40 years old. Its captain, Horatio Decay, was a professional, operating on a philosophy of strategic risk. He knew that his vessel was outdated, but he also knew that in the Antarctic, an old sub is more dangerous than no sub. His logic was to use the Santa Fe as a ferry for reinforced troops to Leith, banking on the idea that the British frigates would stay far offshore to avoid his torpedoes. He was betting on the British being rational. He didn't account for the thinking swimmer on the ridge. Yorkie watched through the spotting scope as the Santa Fe began to unload its cargo at the Leith jetty. The lens was beginning to fog, not from moisture, but from a thin film of ice that was forming on the exterior glass. The thin layer of ice was no longer just on his paddle, it was now a sensory barrier, a crystalline distortion that sat between his eye and the reality of the enemy. He had to use his gloved thumb to constantly scrape the frost away, a repetitive, mechanical action that mirrored the rhythmic scraping of the paddle blades hours before. Each scrape revealed a world that was becoming increasingly violent. If you are compelled by this examination of the friction of history, the way a single radio burst can trigger the collision of naval empires, please consider subscribing. We focus on the structural mechanics of war, the cold variables that decide the fate of thousands in the shadows of the world's most hostile environments. The British response was a multi-dimensional strike. Within 20 minutes of Yorkie's transmission, the acoustic signature of Stromness Bay was shattered. The silence of the Antarctic was replaced by the high-decibel scream of helicopter turbines. First came the Wessex HAS.3 from HMS Antrim, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Ian Stanley. It was the same machine that had performed the Fortuna miracle on the glacier. Now it was no longer a rescue platform. It was a submarine hunter. It carried 2 depth charges, massive steel canisters filled with Torpex explosive, designed to detonate at a preset depth and create a hydraulic hammer that would shatter a submarine's pressure hull. Yorkie watched as the Wessex hovered over the Santa Fe. The geometry of the engagement was perfect. The submarine was still on the surface, its hatch open, its crew in the middle of a logistical transition. In the logic of Captain Decay, he was safe because the British helicopters were search and rescue assets, not attack assets. He was relying on a systemic assumption that was about to be proven fatally wrong. Stanley released the depth charges. The explosion was a physical event that Yorkie felt through the rock of Grass Island. 2 pillars of white water, nearly 100 feet high, erupted on either side of the Santa Fe. The submarine did not sink instantly, but its systemic integrity was compromised. The overpressure from the depth charges buckled the ballast tanks and severed the external hydraulic lines. The Santa Fe began to list to port, its engines coughing out a thick black plume of diesel smoke that smeared the pristine white of the surrounding glaciers. Then came the Wasps and the Lynxes. From the decks of HMS Plymouth and HMS Brilliant, the smaller, more agile helicopters arrived like angry hornets. They were armed with AS-12 missiles, wire-guided anti-ship projectiles. The AS-12 is a weapon of direct intent. It requires the gunner in the helicopter to manually steer the missile using a joystick, trailing a thin copper wire behind it. It is a thinking weapon,
that requires a human to remain locked on the target until the moment of impact. Yorkie saw the first AS-12 strike the Santa Fe's sail, the massive steel tower that houses the periscopes and antennas. The explosion was a bright orange spike against the grey slate of the bay. The thin layer of ice on Yorkie's spotting scope made the explosion look like a blooming flower of fire. He sat there, a biological node in the dirt, watching the industrial destruction of the submarine. He felt a profound sense of disconnection. He was the one who had triggered this event. He was the sensor that had allowed the fist to strike. But he was also a man whose own body was failing. The thermal bridge of the cold was continuing its work. His fingers were no longer feeling the scope. They were just wooden extensions of his arms. He was entering the stasis of the observer, a state where the magnitude of the external event paralyzes the internal needs of the self. In the comments, we want to hear your perspective. In the age of drone warfare and satellite-linked command, is the observer's guilt, the feeling of being responsible for a destruction you do not physically participate in, a new psychological frontier for the modern soldier? The Santa Fe was now a burning wreck. Captain Decay, realizing that his vessel was now a steel coffin, managed to beach the submarine on a sandbar near the Grytviken jetty. The crew scrambled out, some leaping into the freezing water, others climbing onto the deck as the helicopters continued to strafe the hull with GPMG machine gun fire. The big war had won. The Argentine naval presence in South Georgia was neutralized.
But for Yorkie and his partner on Grass Island, the small war was becoming critical. The weather was closing in again. The willy wars were returning, this time bringing a whiteout that erased the bay, the whaling station, and the burning submarine. The visual sensor was now useless. Yorkie was back in the atmospheric vacuum. His partner, who had been silent for 3 hours, began to mumble. It was the incoherent stage of hypothermia. He was talking about a pub in Poole, the Antelope, describing the taste of a pint of bitter in agonizing detail. This was the cognitive fracture. The brain, unable to process the freezing reality, creates a simulated comfort. It is the most dangerous stage of survival. It is the moment the soldier invites the end. Yorkie had to act. The thinking swimmer had to become the medical system. He crawled toward his partner, his movements slow and jerky. Every inch he moved over the frozen tussock grass was a massive metabolic expenditure. He took a chemical heat pad from his survival kit. The pad worked through an exothermic reaction, iron powder oxidizing to generate heat. It was a micro-machine designed to buy 15 minutes of life. He placed the pad against his partner's femoral artery, trying to warm the blood as it returned to the core. The thin layer of ice was now on his partner's eyelashes, sealing his eyes shut. Yorkie looked back toward the harbor. The sounds of the battle were fading, replaced by the low, mournful howl of the wind through the rusted tanks of Leith. The British fleet was withdrawing to the mouth of the bay to avoid the worsening weather. They were leaving the sensors behind. This is the ethics of the elite. The SAS and the SBS are designed to be disposable sensors. They are placed into environments where the extraction is never guaranteed. The planning staff in London had already calculated the acceptable loss of the reconnaissance teams. In the cold mathematics of Operation Paraquet, the destruction of a submarine was worth the lives of a 4-man SBS team. Chapter 3. The Geometry of Isolation. Yorkie realized that no one was coming for them in this weather. The helicopters were grounded, the frigates were fighting the swell. He was alone with a dying partner, a frozen kayak, and an island that wanted to equalize him to 0. He reached for the radio again. He didn't want to call for a strike this time. He wanted to call for a ghost. He needed to know if the second Klepper team, the ones who had capsized, were still in the system. The radio was silent. The thin layer of ice had formed inside the battery compartment,
creating a high-resistance bridge that drained the power. The technology had failed. The thinking swimmer was now stripped of his voice. He was back to the 19th century, back to the raw struggle of the Antarctic explorers. He looked at the paddle blades of the Klepper, still leaning against the rock. They were encased in a solid block of ice now. They looked like glass wings. They were the symbols of his inability to move. As we move into Part 4, we will examine the descent into the tussock, how Yorkie attempted to move his partner across the island in total whiteout, and how the thin layer of ice would become the through line for a discovery that would change the course of the ground assault on South Georgia. The Argentines were not the only ones left in Leith, and Yorkie was about to find out that observation is a two-way street. The ice was thick, the signal was gone, and the thinking swimmer was finally starting to shiver. The real night of the Antarctic had arrived, and the ice was no longer a layer, it was a cage. The silence that follows a naval engagement in the sub-Antarctic is not a void. It is a pressurized weight. As the smoke from the burning Santa Fe was swallowed by the returning whiteout, the acoustic signature of Stromness Bay reverted to its primal state. The low-frequency moan of wind through the rusted iron of the whaling stations, and the rhythmic, grinding surge of the Southern Ocean against the rocks of Grass Island. Yorkie, the SBS operator, felt the structural collapse of his mission. He was no longer a component of the British fleet's sensory array. He was a biological entity whose primary function was now reduced to the maintenance of 37 degrees. The thin layer of ice on the spotting scope had become a total occlusion. The world was now a grey, featureless sphere. His partner's hypothermia had transitioned from the excitation phase, the violent shivering, to the depression phase. This is the point of metabolic surrender. When the body realizes it can no longer generate heat faster than the South Atlantic can strip it away, it begins to shut down the periphery. The partner's heartbeat was slowing, his blood becoming viscous, like the diesel in the Argentine tanks at Leith. Yorkie knew he had to move. On Grass Island, the tussock grass grew in dense, head-high clumps. These mounds of vegetation, while abrasive and difficult to navigate, offered the only thermal shelter on the island. Beneath the canopy of the grass, the wind speed was reduced by 70%, creating a microclimate where the temperature might be 2 or 3 degrees higher than the exposed ridges. In the cold mathematics of survival, 2 degrees is the difference between a casualty and a corpse. He began the geometry of the drag. To move a 200-pound man in full military gear, including a saturated dry suit and a heavy rucksack, across a landscape of frozen peat and slippery grass is a task that defies the standard power-to-weight ratio of the human body. Yorkie had to use a Z-drag technique, hauling his partner 3 meters, then stopping to recover his own breath.
Each breath was a heat exchange, inhaling air at -5 degrees, exhaling it at 37. He was literally breathing away his life force to move the mass. If you are compelled by this clinical examination of the mechanical toll of survival and the cold reality of special operations in the world's most hostile environments, consider liking the video. Your engagement allows us to continue stripping away the Hollywood veneer of war to reveal the raw, structural truth of human endurance. As Yorkie struggled in the tussock, he heard a sound that didn't belong to the wind. It was the high-pitched, metallic chirp of an outboard motor. The Argentine garrison at Leith was not a collection of paralyzed observers. Despite the destruction of the Santa Fe, the Buzos Tácticos, the Argentine tactical divers, were professionals. They had heard the radio burst. They had mapped the line of bearing from their signals intelligence station. They knew that the sensor was on Grass Island. In the logic of the Argentine commander,
The British fleet had withdrawn, leaving their reconnaissance team isolated. It was an opportunity for a counter-reconnaissance strike. Through a momentary thinning of the fog, Yorkie saw a black shape approaching the eastern shore of Grass Island. It was a rigid-hulled inflatable boat, RHIB, carrying 6 men. They were not big war soldiers. They were small war operators, armed with suppressed weapons and night vision goggles. The hunter had become the hunted. Yorkie's hands, those numb clubs of frozen flesh, moved instinctively toward his MP5. But he realized the tactical futility of a firefight. He could not shoot accurately. He could barely feel the trigger. He could not move quickly. His joints were stiff with cryogenic fatigue. He was a degraded system facing a fresh system. He decided to use the only thing the environment gave him: entropy. He didn't engage the RHIB.
Instead, he dragged his partner deeper into the center of a massive tussock clump. He took the thin layer of ice from the paddles, the frozen glass-like blades, and positioned them at the edge of the grass, angled to catch the faint, ambient light of the grey afternoon. He was creating a visual decoy. In the Antarctic, a glint of light is a signal. He wanted the Argentines to believe the sensor was 100 meters to the north. He then performed a thermal deception. He took the last 2 chemical heat pads and buried them in the dirt 10 meters away, covering them with a spare thermal hood. To the Argentine infrared sensors, that small heat spike would look like a human head in a hide. This was the guile of the swimmer. Yorkie was betting that the Argentines would trust their technology more than their instincts. He was betting that they would see the simulation and ignore the reality. The Argentine patrol landed. Yorkie could hear their boots on the frozen rock, the crunch of the old world meeting the ice. They moved with a measured aggression. They were digitizing the island, sweeping their thermal images across the tussock. Yorkie lay motionless over his partner. He was using his own body as a heat shield, suppressing his shivering through a sheer act of neurological will. He was trying to become zero. He was trying to match the temperature of the grass around him. In the comments, I want to hear your perspective. In a situation where your technology is dead and your body is failing, is the individual will a tangible force, or is it merely a biological delusion we use to avoid accepting the inevitability of the end? The Argentine patrol reached the heat spike. Yorkie heard them speaking, hushed, professional Spanish. He heard the thud of a weapon butt hitting the thermal hood. Then, a curse. They realized it was a decoy. But in the geometry of the hunt, a decoy means the target is close. The Argentines began a circle search. They were spreading out, moving in a 360-degree perimeter from the decoy. They were closing the sensory net. One Argentine operator stepped within 3 meters of Yorkie's position. The thin layer of ice on Yorkie's suit crackled slightly as the grass moved. The Argentine stopped. He tilted his head, his night vision goggles glowing like the eyes of a deep-sea predator. This was the 17-second window. If Yorkie moved, he was dead. If he breathed too loudly, the thermal plume of his breath would be visible on the Argentine's sensor. But the South Atlantic intervened. A willy war of unprecedented violence roared down from the mountains of South Georgia. It carried a wall of sleet that hit the island with the force of an explosion. The wind speed jumped from 20 knots to 80 in seconds. The Argentine patrol, caught in the open on the ridge, was literally blown off their feet. Their thermal sensors were whited out by the massive influx of cold air and moisture.
The environmental noise became so great that all human signals were lost. The Argentines, realizing that the island was now a dead zone for anyone not in a shelter, scrambled back toward their RHIB. They had a survival threshold too, and the South Atlantic had just exceeded it. They retreated to Leith, leaving the ghosts alone in the dark. Yorkie waited for an hour. He didn't move until the sound of the outboard motor was gone. He looked at his partner. The mumbles had stopped. The partner was now in a deep stupor. His skin was the color of a blue glacier, the color of tissue that has reached the point of irreversible necrosis. Yorkie reached into his rucksack. He found the emergency flare, a magnesium-based signal designed to burn at 2000 degrees Celsius. It was the ultimate heat source. He didn't fire it into the air. He didn't want the Argentines to see it. He looked at the Klepper's wooden frame, broken during the drag. He looked at the Hypalon's skin. He decided to perform an act of sacrificial survival. He was going to burn the kayak, the 18-foot vessel that was his only way home. The Klepper is made of materials that are not designed to burn. Hypalon is fire-resistant. The wood is saturated with salt and moisture. But a magnesium flare is a chemical hammer. It forces combustion where none should exist. Yorkie ignited the flare. The white fire blinded him instantly, searing his retinas, but he didn't care. He held the flare against the wooden ribs of the Klepper. The thin layer of ice on the wood turned into steam. Then the wood began to char, and finally, it caught. He dragged his partner toward the small, violent sun. For the first time in 30 hours, the thermal debt was being repaid. The heat from the burning kayak began to penetrate the dry suits. The partner's shivering returned. A positive signal. It meant the brain was back in control. The cognitive decay was reversing. As Yorkie sat by the burning ribs of his boat, he looked at the paddle blades. They were melting. The thin layer of ice was turning into water, dripping into the fire with a persistent hiss. Chapter 4. The Geometry of the Last Stand. The kayak was his identity. Without the boat, an SBS operator is just an infantryman in a rubber suit. By burning it, Yorkie had de-badged himself. He had accepted that there was no tactical withdrawal. There was only the island or the rescue. He sat there, a thinking swimmer who no longer had a medium to swim in. He looked at the steel skeleton of the Santa Fe in the harbor, now a dark, silent monument to the Big War. He realized that the Small War had reached its structural limit. As the fire began to fade, leaving only a glowing pile of ash in the tussock, Yorkie heard a new sound. It wasn't a Willy War, and it wasn't an Argentine RHIB. It was the deep, rhythmic thump of a Sea King helicopter. The British fleet had returned. The weather window had opened for exactly 10 minutes. Yorkie stood up. He didn't have a radio, and he didn't have a flare. He had used it to save his friend. He had no digital signal left. He took the only thing he had, the thin layer of ice that had formed on the bottom of his signaling mirror. He scraped the ice away with his fingernails, feeling the jagged edge of the glass. He caught the faint light of the moon through a gap in the clouds and aimed the reflection at the helicopter. The mechanical eye of the Sea King's infrared sensor saw the flash. As we move into Part 5, we will examine the extraction of the frozen, how the SBS team was lifted from Grass Island, and how the thin layer of ice would lead to a strategic discovery that changed the ground assault on South Georgia. The Argentines were not the only ones left in Leith, and Yorkie was about to find out that observation is a two-way street. The rescue was a 17-second miracle, but the cost was written in the scar tissue. The ice was gone, but the cold was forever. The 17-second miracle of an Antarctic extraction is not a moment of cinematic triumph. It is a violent, mechanical collision between the sky and the dirt. When the Sea King HAR-3 from HMS Antrim flared its rotors over the tussock of Grass Island, the downwash was not air. It was a solid wall of ice crystals and salt spray that threatened to extinguish the last embers of Yorkie's burning kayak. The helicopter did not land. In the geometry of the surge, a 10-ton aircraft cannot rest on a ledge of frozen peat. It hovered, its skids 6 inches above the rocks, a screaming, vibrating island of aluminum in a grey void. Yorkie did not walk to the door, he was heaved. The crewman reached out, grabbed the shoulder straps of Yorkie's saturated webbing, and dragged him across the threshold like a piece of salvaged cargo. His partner, now a non-responsive mass of blue-tinged flesh, followed. The door slid shut.
The Sea King banked hard toward the open sea, the pilot fighting a vortex ring state as the wind attempted to swat the helicopter into the bay. Inside the cabin, the sensory transition was absolute. The noise of the engines was a physical assault, but it was the smell that registered first. The scent of aviation fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the stale, warm air of the heater. For Yorkie, this was the smell of the machine. He was no longer a phantom of the Antarctic. He was back in the industrial system. But the system was now focused on his biological failure. The medical reality of re-warming, a severe hypothermia casualty, is a process of controlled agony. On the deck of HMS Antrim, the thinking swimmer was stripped of his dry suit. The suit, once his only protection against the Atlantic, was now a thermal cage, holding the cold moisture against his skin. The medics did not use hot water. Hot water causes peripheral vasodilation, the sudden opening of the surface blood vessels, which can send a slug of cold acidic blood back to the heart, triggering a fatal cardiac arrest. They used passive external re-warming. They wrapped Yorkie in foil blankets and space rugs, layering them to create a static air barrier. Yorkie began to thaw. This is the point where the cryogenic numbness is replaced by the burning of the nerves. As the blood returns to the capillaries, it feels like thousands of needles being driven through the skin. It is the price of the return. Yorkie lay on the deck of the sickbay, his teeth chattering with such violence that he nearly fractured his jaw. He looked at his partner in the next bunk. The partner was being intubated, a heat exchange tube delivering warm, humidified oxygen directly into his lungs. The thin layer of ice was finally being defeated from the inside out. If you appreciate this clinical, unfiltered examination of the mechanical cost of valor and the hidden physics of survival, this is our final chapter. Subscribe and join a community that values the cold, structural truth over the polished myths of history. As his core temperature rose to 35 degrees, the cognitive threshold, Yorkie's brain began to reassemble the digital image of the mission. He asked for a debrief. The thinking swimmer was back online. He didn't talk about the cold. He didn't talk about the Argentine RHIB. He spoke about the geometry of the defense. He had seen something through his spotting scope just before the ice had occluded the lens. He had seen the Argentine commander at Leith, Captain Alfredo Astiz, supervising the placement of Bantam anti-tank missiles on the roofs of the whaling station. This was actionable intelligence. The British planning staff had assumed the Argentines only had small arms and mortars. The presence of guided missiles changed the calculus of the assault. If the Royal Marines landed in their rigid raiders,
They would be target practice for the Bantams. The thin layer of ice on the scope had almost cost the British the ground war. But Yorkie's manual scraping, the physical act of resisting the ice, had allowed him to see the secret. Chapter 5. The Logic of the End. The final assault on South Georgia, codenamed Operation Paraquet, began on April 25, 1982. It was a big war event fueled by small war data. Based on Yorkie's intelligence, the British frigates, HMS Plymouth and HMS Antrim, moved into the bay. They didn't land the troops immediately. They performed a naval bombardment. They used their 4.5-inch Mark 8 guns to perform surgical demolition. They weren't firing at the buildings, they were firing at the missile nodes Yorkie had identified. The geometry of the shelling was terrifyingly precise. From 5 miles out, the frigates were dropping 45-pound high-explosive shells onto the specific rooftops of Leith. The Argentine garrison, which had spent 3 weeks believing they were invisible in the mist, suddenly found their structural sanctuary being dismantled around them. Captain Astis, a man whose career had been built on the shadow war of the Argentine junta's dirty war, was faced with a symmetry of violence he could not counter. He was an expert at disappearing unarmed civilians, but he had no answer for a Royal Navy frigate that was disappearing his defences from beyond the horizon. The psychological collapse was instantaneous. When the Royal Marines and the remaining SAS/SBS elements finally landed on the jetties of Grytviken and Leith, there was no last stand. There was no Antarctic Alamo. The Argentines surrendered without firing a shot. The big war ended with a signature on a piece of paper in a rusted whaling shack. But the small war, the one fought in the Klepper kayaks and the tussock grass, remained in the bodies of the men. In the comments, we want to hear your final perspective. In the history of conflict, which is the greater victory? The loud bombardment that forces a surrender, or the silent observation that makes the bombardment possible? Can one exist without the other? Yorkie was eventually awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. His partner survived, though he lost 3 toes to non-freezing cold injury, the permanent mechanical failure of the tissue. They returned to the SBS base at Poole, back to the North Sea, back to the medium of the water. But the thin layer of ice never truly left Yorkie. For the rest of his life, he would experience a sensory echo. Every time he picked up a tool, a knife, a pen, a steering wheel, he would instinctively check the surface for a glaze. He would find himself scraping at things that weren't there. It was a neurological artifact of the Antarctic. The brain had been so thoroughly conditioned to fear the incremental weight of ice that it could no longer trust the texture of the world. This is the legacy of the swimmer. The SAS and the SBS are the human sensors of the British state. They are sent to the edges of the map to test the structural limits of the enemy and the environment. They achieve strategic effects through biological suffering. The thin layer of ice is the perfect skvozhnaya metafora, through-line metaphor, for the fragility of the elite. We are told that special operations forces are superhuman. We are shown images of high-tech gear, night vision, and suppressed weapons. But Mirbat, the Fuke Twi, and South Georgia all prove the same objective truth. The soldier is a chemical machine. He is a system that requires oxygen, sugar, and heat. When you strip away the technology, when the battery dies and the helicopter crashes, you are left with a 170-pound organism fighting the laws of physics. The thin layer of ice on the paddle was a microscopic fact, but multiplied by 5 miles in 6 hours, it became a structural crisis. It was the friction that nearly killed the mission. The 25-pounder at Mirbat was a relic. The dry leaf in Vietnam was a signal. The ice in the South Atlantic was a parasite. In each of these stories,
The thinking soldier succeeded not because he was stronger than the environment, but because he was more precise. He understood the geometry of the problem, and he applied the minimum effective force to solve it. He scraped the ice. He stayed still. He loaded the shell. As we conclude this series on the cold realities of conflict, we are left with a final philosophical reflection. Civilization is itself a thin layer of ice. It is a delicate, transparent glaze of laws, technology, and budgets that sits over the dark ocean of human nature and environmental entropy. We believe we are safe because we have heaters and satellites.
But the men of the SBS know the truth. They know that the ice is always growing. They know that the Antarctic night is always waiting. And they know that the only thing that keeps the systems from equalizing to zero is a small group of thinking swimmers who are willing to sit in the dark, scraping the frost away with their fingernails, waiting for the 17 seconds that decide the fate of empires. The ice is thin, the water is deep, and the thinking swimmer is always watching. Thank you for your intelligence. The record of Operation Paraquet is now closed, but the cold remains.